Every time I hit record, everything just vacates my head and it's becoming a real problem. Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Bintou. I hope that you are all doing well. We finally reached the end of June, which means that it is time for me to film my June wrap up. June was actually a pretty good month. I read 14 books. Small asterisk there because technically I'm only halfway through the 14th book, but as I'm filming this, it is only June 29th, which means that I will probably have it finished by tomorrow. Therefore, a full 14 books. I'm pretty pumped about that actually, especially since last month was so bad. All right, so let's talk about the book. The first book that I read this month was White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide by Carol Anderson. And I actually did an entire review on this book. I gave this book 5 stars and it definitely is recommended reading. So what this book does is it takes us through a semi-detailed history of racism in America. She starts with slavery, and then there's the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and then all the way up to present day. She goes into all the different ways that racism has affected Black people in America, and she begins with a discussion of the more overt racism that existed during the Reconstruction era and Jim Crow, where there was more brutal lynching and just massacring of Black people in America, all the way up to more present day where politicians now use laws and the courts in order to stunt the progression of Black people in America. Throughout all of this, she discusses how the courts have done a very poor job of preventing this from happening, these violations in civil rights for Black people in America. And probably most importantly, she talks about how all of that history has led to the racial inequality that manifests itself in present day America. I said it before and I'll say it again, this is very, very important reading. I think that this history isn't really taught in schools, and I certainly did not learn this much about the history of Blacks in America until I read Carol Anderson's book. So actually I have read her other book, We Are Not Yet Equal, earlier this year, and these two books are very similar. If you've read one, you probably don't need to read the other. I think they were meant to be targeted to different audiences. One is YA and one is adult. But understanding the history behind racism, and more importantly how it's changed, again from a more overt violent form of racism to the present covert style of racism that we see that still affect people of color in this country and around the world, is really important to understand. All right, so the next book that I read this month was Embracing Failure, and if you've already seen my mid-year book freak out tag, then you know that I was pretty disappointed by this book. I want to clarify something. The reason that I found it not very useful is because I feel like all of the life lessons that he was trying to impart on the reader are things that I have already figured out at this point in my life. So perhaps this book is targeted to someone who is in high school or is just out of college and hasn't yet had any adult life experience. And also it is more business focused than specifically life advice focused. So that's something that's important to know. A lot of the lessons that he's trying to teach in business do apply in life, and he does emphasize that, so he makes sure to provide examples of these lessons both in business and in life. But like I said, for me it didn't really add value. I gave it 3 stars. It's pretty short and pretty easy to read, and it might be a good starting place for someone who is just getting their feet off the ground in their business or in their adult life and are looking for some short pieces of wisdom that they can apply to their lives. Onwards to the next book. So the third book I read this month was Not a Crime to Be Poor, The Criminalization of Poverty in America. This book was really fascinating. So I don't know too much about our criminal justice system, and what the author does in this book is he basically is talking about how we've gotten to a point where our criminal justice system is disproportionately punishing poor people and people of color, minorities. One of the biggest takeaways from this book is how if you are poor, something as simple as a ticket can get you into this never-ending cycle within the criminal justice system, and how poverty is both a cause and a consequence of criminality. So a classic example is that if you get a ticket that's maybe a couple $100s, someone who is relatively wealthy can just pay that off and that would be the end of it. However, if you can't afford that ticket, you end up accumulating more fines. You may have to go to court, and if you can't afford to pay court fees, you may have your license suspended and you could eventually be jailed. And something that I had no idea is that you are charged room and board afford in jail, which means you're accumulating even more debt while you're being jailed when you have no income coming in. And then of course, if you are convicted of a crime, it affects your ability to gain employment and housing. So you can see how being poor would lead you to enter the criminal justice system because you have no way of paying your way out of it. But also, once you are in the system, it will exacerbate poverty and almost prevent any chance of ever escaping it. I think his discussion on money bail is probably the most salient point in this book, at least it was to me, because, and he says this, rich people make bail, but poor people don't. And that means that oftentimes they're just held in jail without having been convicted of any crime, simply awaiting trial because they could not afford to pay bail. I'm actually gonna do a full book review on this, but I give this book 5 stars. I learned so much from reading this book. And if you're interested in learning more about how our criminal justice system is set up to disproportionately affect poor people and minorities, then this is definitely a good place to start. All right, next book this month was Edge Dancer by Sanderson. So I already talked about this twice. I did a review and I talked about it in my mid-year freakout tag. I did not love this book simply because I don't love the character Liv. I think someone left a comment saying that she's like a whiny teenager, and that's exactly what she's like. My whole job is dealing with whiny teenagers, so I guess I don't love to tolerate that in books that I read. So yeah, not my favorite storyline, but I still do recommend the Stormlight Archive books. They are probably my most favorite piece of fiction. Okay, so next book is The Color Purple by Alice Walker. I'm not sure why I hadn't read this book before, but I'm really glad I picked it up. And it was a part of Kindle Unlimited, which is why I added it onto my TBR this month. So the way that this book is set up is that we're following the main character, Celie, and she's writing letters to God. So the book is just a collection of letters, basically, from Celie. You find out within the first, I think it's the first chapter, or definitely within the first 2 chapters, that Celie has been suffering sexual abuse at the hands of her father, and that's led to 2 pregnancies, and both of those babies have been taken away from her and they've been given away. As a result of the pregnancies, she's unable to continue with her education, so she's had to drop out of school, and she's eventually married off to a man who actually wanted her sister. In her marriage, she suffers even more abuse at the hands of her husband, who is actually in love with another woman, and she's gonna come into the picture as well later on. While I really enjoyed reading this book, it is a really sad story, especially in the beginning. The book isn't graphic, but the content itself can be difficult to read and quite heartbreaking at times. What I loved most about this book is just watching Celie's transformation from the start to the end. So in the beginning, she kind of accepts all of the bad things that are happening to her and has a just put your head down and stick it through mentality, which is also a special kind of courage. One of the characters points this out, being able to suffer through all that she has suffered and maintain your optimism and simple will to live really is in itself a kind of courage. But as the book progresses, we begin to see her take more agency over her life, and we also see her explore her sexuality and come to realize that men aren't great. So she actually, I think towards the end, kind of despises men and doesn't want anything to do with them. So that's really fascinating too. Overall, I give this book 4.5 stars. I really loved it. All right, so next book on my list was Rain Will Come. And this book is one of the Amazon first reads, Amazon Prime first reads. So if you have Amazon Prime, they send you an email at the beginning of every month where you can just pick an upcoming book for free. And this is been on my list for a while because I think this came out several months ago and I just hadn't gotten around to it. And this book is sort of a legal police procedural thriller. The book begins with a man who finds out that he has terminal cancer and he will die soon. So he decides that he's gonna go out and basically dole vigilante justice to some really, really evil people. And the people that he picks have committed some pretty heinous crimes, mostly against children, usually just extreme abuse and neglect of young children, and they have gotten away with it somehow, or they are getting away with it. And so he finds them and he tortures them and eventually kills them. A detective in Chicago has put together the individual crimes after about the second one. So he's trying to track the killer and prevent him from continuing on to murder more people. The nice thing about it is that you can see that the detective admires this man in some way because he knows that the people this man is killing kind of deserve it. They're they're pretty awful people, but at the same time, he needs to do his job to try and catch him and prevent him from murdering people. Overall, I don't think this is particularly novel. It's a pretty typical storyline in this genre, but it was a good read, and I believe this was a debut novel for this author. I give it about 3.5 stars, rounded up to 4. All right, next book is Black Tide, The Devastating Impact of the Gulf Oil Spill. This book was long, but it was full of a lot of information. A lot of it was useful. However, I think it was a little bit too long. And that was my main critique of this book. So first, let's get into what it's about. There was the massive BP oil spill in 2010. And I actually realized as I read this book that I didn't know much about it, and it would have been when I was a college freshman, maybe sophomore, so I guess I wasn't too aware of world events at that point in my life. But the basic gist is that the company BP, British Petroleum, they were cutting a bunch of corners trying to save money, which led to equipment failures that they already knew about but didn't fix, and all of this culminated in a massive disaster where they couldn't stop all the oil that was gushing out of a deep water well that they were drilling out of, and eventually their vessel just caught fire and sank. Several people died as a result of this accident, and a large portion of the rest of the book is BP's efforts to minimize their economic liability as a result of this disaster by basically outright lying to the public. It really amazed me the things that they did in order to try and cover up how much oil was being spilled, and all in the name of trying to limit how much money they would eventually have to pay out. So one of the things that they did is they used these dispersants, which are chemicals that break up the oil. The problem is that dispersants don't actually remove the oil, they simply break it up. So the reason they did this is because the dispersants, once they broke up the oil, it would look like there was less oil in the water, and as the oil washed up ashore, same thing, it would look like there was less of it. The problem is that these dispersants contain chemicals that are very, very harmful to both people and to marine life, and it also actually makes it even harder to clean up the oil. They were also burning the oil off of the surface of the water, which led to some serious health problems for both the workers and for the people that lived in the area. And probably the most important point she was trying to make is that all of the oil companies got together and blamed BP's incompetence for this disaster, but none of the major oil companies would have been prepared to deal with it any better. And they still aren't. You can really tell that the author is very passionate about this, and especially passionate about preventing another major oil disaster because, and she does detail all of this in the book, the consequences of that oil spilled into the water were so extraordinary, and it's important that another disaster like that is prevented from happening again. I gave this book 4 stars. I think that it had very good information, but I think that it was just a little bit too long, and sometimes she jumped around in her timeline, and that could make it a little bit confusing, especially as you got to the end of the book. Overall though, it is a book worth reading if you want to know more about the BP oil spill. This isn't a very popular book. I think on my Goodreads it said that it was the least popular actually, so the least number of reviews available for this book. That doesn't surprise me. It is a very, very specific book on a very specific topic. All right, so the next set of books, there are 3 of them. I'm just gonna put them together. Basically what happened was, because the first half of my reading so far this month had been just so much. It was so serious. There were several nonfiction books, and even some of the fiction books were just, they were heavy. I decided that I wanted to read something fun, so I went through Kindle Unlimited to see if there were any good romances, and I stumbled across this set by Amy Dawes. It's called the Wait With Me series. So the first book is called Wait With Me, and it's supposed to be a rom-com, which is about right. It's also a blue-collar romance, which I did not even know that was a genre. But basically the main character, Kate, is a writer, but she's suffering from writer's block. So she decides to work at the customer service center of a tire shop where they have a bunch of free coffee and pastries, and she finds that she can work there. While she's there, she runs into Miles, who is a mechanic, and the romance continues from there. I really enjoyed reading this. In fact, I enjoyed it so much that I immediately picked up the second and the third book in the series and read all of them. The second book follows Miles, the character from the first book, his best friend Sam, and his sister Maggie. Of course, at the beginning, they don't know each other. They don't know who each other is to Miles, and they meet going ice fishing. I don't know what ice fishing is. romance. Never heard of it before this book, but apparently it's how a romance gets started. So you can probably predict where this is gonna go. Eventually, Miles is gonna find out. There's gonna be some punches thrown, but it's another rom-com, and I like this one just as much as the first one. The third one was probably my least favorite of the three. This one follows a doctor and the best friend of Kate, who was the main character in the first book. And the plot line starts out very similar. So she is writing a dissertation and she's having trouble writing, so she works in a hospital cafeteria in order to finish her work. And then there's this doctor who notices that she's there all the time for some very bizarre reason. They eventually get together and she becomes pregnant. And so the rest of the book is resolving all of that. Overall, it was still fun to read. It wasn't as good as the other two, but I gave it 4 stars. After that derailment, I finally got my hands on If It Bleeds by Stephen King. I got off the waitlist at my library, and so I was able to read it this month. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, but it was a little underwhelming. And I think the reason might be that I'm just not a short story kind of person. I don't read short stories very often, and I think the reason that I don't like them is because they're just not long enough to flesh out the characters and the details. And my favorite Stephen King novels are his really, really long novels. I like getting to know the characters over a long period of time, and I like a plot that will develop. So for example, one of the short stories, which is called The Life of Chuck, was probably my least favorite in this collection, simply because nothing was happening. So it was just, so we're following some events in the life of this man Chuck, or Charles. And the only interesting part about it is that it is told in reverse order. So you start with his death and then you make your way down to his childhood. There's one minor supernatural element that comes up at the very, very end of this story, but otherwise this one was by far my least favorite of the 4. The one I liked the most was If It Bleeds, which is the name of one of the stories inside of this book. And it brings back Holly Gibney, and I really like Holly Gibney. I read the book The Outsider a couple years ago, and this story is basically another retelling of The Outsider. So for that reason, I don't feel like it was too original. Having read The Outsider, there wasn't anything too new here, but basically she encounters another creature who's capable of changing his face and feeds off of the pain and misery of people. So he's always present at these mass casualty tragedies that occur, and he's a reporter. Holly is able to put together who he is, and she's trying to flesh him out and deal with him. Overall, I gave If It Bleeds about 3.5 stars. It was still pretty enjoyable, but like I said, I don't think his short stories are really my thing. And then the last book, which is the book that I'm currently reading, is Twisted: The Tangled History of Black Hair Culture. And I picked this up after seeing a review by Ghost Reader here on YouTube. I just thought it would be super fascinating to hear about someone else's experience with black hair. And her experience is especially fascinating because she's Irish, or she's half Irish and half Nigerian, and she grew up during a period of time in Ireland where there was no one around that had hair like her. So it was a constant source of difficulty and shame for her. And she talks about how her view on her hair has changed over time, but also probably most important to me was she brings into it the cultural history of black hair, and not just in Western countries, but also in Africa and in Caribbean countries as well. And there's a lot of stuff there that I did not know about. I'm about halfway through this book, and I will probably finish it in the next day or two, and I'm super excited to as well. So far, I am enjoying it. I think that the writing, especially her organization, is a little confusing at times. I don't love that about this book, and when I finish it, I'll probably be knocking off half a star at least for that, but I am enjoying the actual content, so that's good. All right, I finally reached the end of all the books that I've read for the month of June. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you guys got something out of it. Let me know in the comments some of the books that you guys have read in the month of June. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and I will see you in the next one.